I am Amanda Miller, 32 years old, watching my half-sister Natalie's wedding from my apartment when my world imploded. They claimed the venue had limited capacity, so I could only attend virtually. As the ceremony reached its peak, I spotted something impossible. My fiancé Thomas sitting with my family, wearing a suit he claimed was at the dry cleaners. He was supposed to be in Chicago on business. The live stream froze at that exact moment, capturing the betrayal perfectly. That frozen image would shatter my family forever and expose 6 years of elaborate lies. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. This family revenge story still makes my hands shake when I tell it. If betrayal by those closest to you sounds familiar, hit subscribe because trust me, what happened next changed everything. The karma that came back around in this family drama was something no one saw coming. To understand how I ended up watching my half-sister's wedding online while everyone else in my family attended in person, you need to know our complicated history. My parents divorced when I was 14. I still remember the night my dad, Richard Miller, told me he was leaving. He packed his suitcases while my mom Karen sobbed in their bedroom. I stood in the hallway, clutching my childhood teddy bear, even though I was too old for it, watching as 18 years of marriage disintegrated before my eyes. "It's not about you, Amanda," he said, not even looking at me as he zipped his luggage. "Your mother and I just grew apart." That was the first lie in what would become an intricate web of deception. Within 3 months, my father married Stephanie, a woman 15 years younger than him who worked at his real estate development company. I later discovered their affair had been going on for 2 years before the divorce. When I was 16, they had Natalie, my half-sister. From that moment, I felt myself being gradually erased from my father's life. The photos of me that once lined his office walls were replaced with professional family portraits of him, Stephanie, and baby Natalie. When I visited their new home every other weekend, I stayed in the guest room that felt increasingly less like it belonged to me. My bedroom at my mom's house remained frozen in teenage decor well into my 20s because we couldn't afford to update it after the divorce settlement left her financially strained. My father's real estate business boomed after the divorce. He built luxury housing developments across 3 states while my mom worked 2 jobs to keep our modest 3-bedroom house. The contrast between my 2 lives couldn't have been more stark. At Dad's house, everything was premium and pristine. At Mom's, we clipped coupons and drove a car that made concerning noises when it rained. The pattern of exclusion started small. When I was 17, they took Natalie to Disney World because you have finals that week, Amanda. When I was 20, they celebrated Christmas in Switzerland but couldn't get another ticket at such short notice. By 25, I was routinely discovering family events had occurred only after seeing photos on social media. "You're being too sensitive," became my father's go-to response whenever I expressed hurt feelings. "We're not excluding you on purpose. It's just logistics." My mother passed away from breast cancer when I was 27. The funeral was the last time the entire extended family was together in one place. My father gave a stiff, formal eulogy that focused more on their early dating years than their marriage or her role as a mother. Stephanie stood beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, while Natalie, then 11, looked bored and played games on a tablet throughout the service. After Mom died, I threw myself into my career as a graphic designer. I built a modest but growing freelance business working remotely for clients across the country. My apartment was small but mine, paid for with money I earned myself, unlike my half-sister's private school education and designer wardrobe. I met Thomas Reeves 3 years ago through mutual friends at a housewarming party. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my design work. With dark hair that always fell just right and an easy laugh, he quickly became the center of my world. He worked at a tech startup developing some kind of financial software I never fully understood, but his ambition impressed me. Within 6 months we moved in together, and last year, he proposed with a modest but beautiful ring. Thomas knew all about my family situation. He held me on the anniversaries of my mother's death when I couldn't stop crying. He listened to my frustrations about being excluded from another family vacation. He even encouraged me to keep trying with my father. Family is important, he would say. Sometimes you have to be the bigger person. In retrospect, his insistence that I maintain contact with my father despite the ongoing hurt should have been my first red flag. Thomas met my father and Stephanie at a tense dinner shortly after we got engaged. I noticed they seemed to hit it off surprisingly well, with my father asking detailed questions about Thomas's startup. They exchanged phone numbers to discuss potential investment opportunities. I was pleased at the time, thinking it might help bridge the family gap. Over the past year, I noticed increasingly strange behavior from both Thomas and my family. Thomas had more business dinners and investor meetings than seemed normal for his position. My father occasionally mentioned Thomas in phone calls, but would quickly change the subject when I asked for details. Stephanie began sending me birthday and holiday cards, something she had never bothered with before. It all seemed odd, but I was so happy to see positive movement in our family relationships that I ignored my instincts. After years of feeling like an outsider, I was finally seeing glimmers of acceptance. Or so I thought. The truth was much darker than I could have imagined, and it would take a wedding live stream freezing at exactly the wrong moment for everything to come crashing down. The digital invitation to Natalie's wedding arrived in my email on a Tuesday morning in April. I nearly spat out my coffee when I saw it. My half-sister was only 17, barely out of high school. The invitation was elaborate, with animated butterflies that fluttered across the screen, and a custom soundtrack. It announced the union of Natalie Miller and Jackson Price at my father's sprawling estate in the Hamptons, 3 months from now in July. I immediately called my father, who sounded strangely nervous when he answered. "Amanda, I was going to call you today," he said before I could even mention the invitation. "Dad, Natalie is 17. Isn't this a little young to be getting married?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "She's very mature for her age," he replied defensively. "Jackson comes from an excellent family. His father and I have business connections going back 15 years. The conversation quickly took an uncomfortable turn when I asked about travel arrangements. "Actually, about that," my father said, clearing his throat. "We're having to limit the in-person guests quite strictly." "What does that mean?" I asked, already feeling a familiar sinking sensation. "The venue has capacity limitations," he explained, though the venue was his own 15-acre estate with multiple buildings and expansive grounds. Fire codes and all that. But we've arranged for professional live streaming for extended family and friends who can't attend in person." "You're saying I can't come to my own sister's wedding?" My voice cracked despite my efforts to remain composed. "Half-sister," Stephanie interjected in the background, not quite quietly enough. "And it's not just you, Amanda. We had to make difficult decisions about the guest list." I later discovered that distant cousins I'd never even heard of had received physical invitations while I was relegated to the virtual experience. "It's really the next best thing to being there," my father continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I knew too well. "The streaming company is top-notch. Multiple camera angles, high definition. You'll be able to see everything. We'll even wave to the camera for you." That night, I told Thomas about the wedding and my exclusion from the in-person guest list. He seemed unusually interested in the details, asking questions about the date and location. Then he delivered his own news. "That's the same weekend as the Chicago conference," he said, frowning as he checked his calendar. "I have to present our new software platform to potential investors. There's no way I can reschedule. So, I'll be watching Natalie's wedding alone?" I tried not to sound as pathetic as I felt. "I'm sorry, babe." He kissed my forehead. "But hey, maybe it's for the best. Those family events are always stressful for you anyway." In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I received increasingly detailed emails about the live stream. Technical instructions, testing links, even suggestions for creating an immersive at-home experience, including recommended champagne pairings for different parts of the ceremony. The level of production value, for excluding me, was almost impressive. Meanwhile, Thomas became busy with preparation for his Chicago trip. He bought a new suit, claiming his old one was too worn for important investor meetings. He took it to the dry cleaners and said he'd pick it up right before his flight. "This deal could change everything for us," he said excitedly. "If I land these investors, We might be able to afford that house we looked at. I was supportive, if distracted by the approaching wedding. I helped him prepare his presentation, giving design feedback and practicing questions with him late into the night. A week before the wedding, I started seeing social media posts from relatives. Aunt Judith posting about her flight to New York. Cousin Patrick checking in at a hotel near my father's estate. Everyone was arriving early for various pre-wedding events, a welcome dinner, a beach party, a golf outing. The night before Thomas was scheduled to leave for Chicago, I used his laptop to order food while he showered. A notification popped up from his email. Without really thinking about it, I clicked it open. It was a hotel confirmation for the Hampton Bay Resort, less than a mile from my father's estate, for the entire wedding weekend. The reservation was for 2 adults. My hand shook as I quickly closed the email and shut the laptop. It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was for someone at his company. Perhaps he'd booked it before realizing he had the conference. I created a dozen explanations in my mind, none of which addressed the gnawing feeling in my stomach. When Thomas emerged from the shower, I almost confronted him. But some self-protective instinct held me back. Instead, I smiled and asked if he'd packed everything for Chicago. "All set," he said, kissing me casually. "I'll call you every night, I promise." The morning Thomas left, he seemed oddly formal. His hug was stiff, his kiss brief. He left 4 hours before his supposed flight, claiming he needed extra time for security. "Have fun watching the wedding," he said as he rolled his suitcase to the door. "Take some screenshots for me." If only he knew how literally I would take that suggestion. The day before the wedding, I received texts from both my father and Stephanie, reminding me to log in early to get the full pre-ceremony experience. Natalie sent a single message. "Hope the stream works LOL." I spent that evening alone in my apartment, trying not to feel sorry for myself. I opened a bottle of wine and scrolled through social media, torturing myself with images of the rehearsal dinner I wasn't invited to. There was Aunt Judith with her arm around Natalie. There was Uncle Robert making a toast. And in the background of one photo, so quick I almost missed it, a familiar profile that looked unnervingly like Thomas. But when I went back to look more closely, the photo had been deleted. Sleep eluded me that night as my mind raced with possibilities, each more painful than the last. By morning, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. The wedding was at 2 o'clock. I had 5 hours to pull myself together and prepare to watch my half-sister get married through a computer screen. The morning of Natalie's wedding, I decided to make the best of the situation. If I had to watch from 200 miles away, I would at least do it with style. I put on a navy blue cocktail dress I'd been saving for a special occasion, did my makeup carefully, and even ordered myself a small bouquet of flowers to mark the day. I set up my laptop on the dining table, connected it to the television for a larger view, and opened the bottle of champagne I'd been saving for Thomas's return. The live stream began an hour before the ceremony, with sweeping drone shots of my father's estate. The property looked even more impressive from the air, with manicured gardens, a reflecting pool, and white chairs arranged in perfect rows on the main lawn. A string quartet played softly as guests arrived, the women in colorful summer dresses, the men in light suits appropriate for a July afternoon. I poured myself champagne and watched as the camera panned across the gathering crowd. I recognized relatives I hadn't seen in years. My father's business associates. Stephanie's large extended family. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time, greeting each other with hugs and air kisses, accepting flutes of champagne from circulating waiters. The camera occasionally focused on Natalie getting ready in my father's house, her makeup being applied by a professional artist, Stephanie fussing with the veil. My half-sister looked beautiful in an elaborate gown that probably cost more than my annual rent. For a moment, I felt a pang of something like affection for her. She was just a teenager, after all. This whole excessive production wasn't her fault. At exactly 2 o'clock, the music changed and the ceremony began. The officiant took his place under an archway covered in white roses. The groom, Jackson, walked to the front with his best man. I didn't know much about Jackson except that he came from money and had known my father for years through business connections. The wedding party proceeded down the aisle one by one. Bridesmaids in pale pink dresses. Groomsmen looking uncomfortable in their formal wear in the summer heat. A flower girl who looked to be about 4 scattering rose petals with determined concentration. As the camera panned across the seated guests during the procession, I started noticing faces that made my blood run cold. My cousin Melissa, who had told me she couldn't afford to fly in from California. My father's oldest friend, Bernard, who had messaged me last week saying he was having surgery and would also be watching online. And then, in the third row on the groom's side, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement but unmistakable to me, Thomas. My Thomas. My fiancé. The man who was supposed to be in Chicago presenting to investors. He was wearing the new suit he'd bought, his hair freshly cut, looking completely at ease. He was seated between my Uncle Philip and a woman I recognized as my father's executive assistant. I choked on my champagne, spilling it down the front of my dress. I fumbled for the remote to pause the stream, but in my shock, I dropped it. By the time I retrieved it from under the table, the camera had moved on to show Natalie beginning her walk down the aisle on my father's arm. I sat frozen, barely breathing, as the ceremony continued. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. There had to be an explanation. A coincidence. A misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. The camera returned to wider shots of the guests during the vows. I scrutinized every frame, searching for Thomas. There he was again, smiling as Natalie and Jackson exchanged rings. He looked completely at home, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to my uncle. This wasn't someone who had been invited at the last minute. This was someone who belonged there. As my half-sister and her new husband shared their first kiss as a married couple, the camera panned across the applauding crowd. And that's when the live stream froze. The image that burned itself into my retinas was devastating in its perfect clarity. Thomas standing and applauding with everyone else, a broad smile on his face. My father with his arm around Stephanie, looking triumphant. And most shocking of all, around Stephanie's neck was my grandmother's sapphire pendant, a family heirloom that my mother had always told me would be mine someday. I stared at the frozen image, unable to move or think clearly. The seconds ticked by, but the stream didn't resume. The technical difficulties couldn't have happened at a more revealing moment. It was as if the universe wanted me to have time to fully absorb every detail of the betrayal playing out before me. With shaking hands, I took screenshots of the frozen frame, zooming in on Thomas, on the necklace, on my father's smug expression. I tried refreshing the page, but a message appeared saying, "Connection lost. Please stand by." I grabbed my phone and called Thomas. Straight to voicemail. I texted him. "I can see you at the wedding. What the hell is going on?" The message showed as delivered but not read. I tried my father next. Again, voicemail. I left a message that consisted mostly of incoherent questions and barely contained sobs. Finally, I texted Natalie. "Congratulations on your wedding. Interesting to see Thomas there when he told me he was in Chicago." 3 disappeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared. No message came. I sat in my apartment, still dressed up with nowhere to go, surrounded by the trappings of my pathetic solo wedding viewing party, and let the tears come. I cried until my makeup ran in black streaks down my face. I cried until the champagne went flat. I cried until the neighbors knocked on the wall to check if I was okay. When the tears finally subsided, something else took their place. Cold, calculating anger. I looked again at the screenshots I'd taken. There was a story here that needed to be uncovered. Why was Thomas at my half-sister's wedding? Why was Stephanie wearing my grandmother's necklace? Why had so many people lied to me? The live stream never came back online. Instead, an apologetic email arrived from the streaming company citing technical difficulties beyond our control. But it didn't matter. I'd seen enough. I spent the rest of that evening in a strange, calm state, methodically making notes about everything I'd observed and every question I needed answered. As night fell, I opened my laptop again, but not to check for updates on the wedding. Instead, I began what would become a weeks-long investigation into the web of lies surrounding me. If you've ever had that moment where everything you thought was true suddenly shatters, you know exactly how I felt. The betrayal cuts deeper when it's family, doesn't it? Looking back now, I realize that frozen wedding live stream was actually a gift, forcing me to see what had been happening right in front of me all along. If you're dealing with family betrayal too, comment below with a ice cube emoji so I know I'm not alone in this experience. Now, let me tell you how I started uncovering the full extent of their deception. The day after the wedding, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity despite having barely slept. The initial shock had given way to a cold determination to uncover the truth. I called in sick to my freelance projects, made a large pot of coffee, and transformed my living room into an investigation headquarters. I started with social media. While the wedding party would be celebrating at brunches and gift openings, guests would inevitably be posting photos. I wasn't friends with many of my father's social circle, but their privacy settings were often lacking. Through public tags and location markers, I began piecing together more of the wedding than the live stream had shown me. There was Thomas in the background of a group shot at the rehearsal dinner, his arm casually draped over the back of my cousin's chair. There he was again in a selfie taken by one of the bridesmaids, raising a glass during a toast. Each image was a fresh stab of betrayal, but I saved them all as evidence. Most revealing was a photo posted by my father's golf buddy, a candid shot of my father, Thomas, and Jackson's father standing together near the bar, deep in conversation. The caption read, "The Three Musketeers planning the next venture. Hashtag family business, hashtag wedding weekend, family business?" What family business involved Thomas? I moved on to email. Thomas and I shared a cloud storage account for practical purposes, and he hadn't been careful about what synced there. I found emails going back 8 months between him and my father, discussing the arrangement and keeping Amanda in the dark until the time is right. Most details were frustratingly vague or conducted in phone calls I wasn't privy to, but the pattern was clear. They had been in regular contact without my knowledge. The most damning evidence came from Thomas's calendar, which also synced to our shared cloud. For months, entries labeled investor meeting or client dinner corresponded exactly with texts he'd sent me about working late. But in his private notes section, the true nature of these meetings was revealed. Dinner with Richard and Stephanie, or golf with Richard and Jackson's dad. As morning turned to afternoon, and then evening, I kept digging. I created a timeline on my bedroom wall using sticky notes and string, like a detective in a crime show. Yellow for lies Thomas had told me. Blue for family events I'd been excluded from. Red for financial transactions I was beginning to uncover. Through my father's company website, I found press releases announcing a new partnership with Reeves Tech Solutions to develop property management software. Thomas's startup. The timing coincided with when he'd first met my father, right after we got engaged. Had their entire relationship been a business arrangement? The thought made me physically ill. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered anyway, hoping it might be Thomas calling from a hotel. "Amanda? It's Brad Jenkins." It took me a moment to place the name. Brad had been my grandmother's attorney before she passed away 5 years ago. I'd met him only once, at the reading of her will. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he continued when I didn't immediately respond. "I saw your sister's wedding announcement in the Times, and it reminded me of something I've been troubled by for years." "What is it?" I asked, fully alert now. "Your grandmother's will. The one we executed wasn't the one she had me prepare originally. She made changes in the final weeks of her life, when she was heavily medicated. I had concerns about her capacity at that time, but your father insisted she was lucid. My grandmother had left everything to my father, with specific items designated for Stephanie, and, eventually, Natalie. I had received only a small cash bequest, and none of the family heirlooms or property that had been promised to me throughout my childhood. What was in the original will?" I asked, my heart pounding. "She left her house in Vermont to you, specifically. And the sapphire jewelry set that had come down through the maternal line. She was quite clear that those items were to go directly to you, not through your father." The sapphire pendant that had been around Stephanie's neck at the wedding. The Vermont house that my father had sold almost immediately after my grandmother's death, claiming it had been too much of a burden to maintain. Can you send me documentation of the original will? I asked. That's why I'm calling. I kept copies, against my better judgment. I always felt something wasn't right. The next morning, the documents arrived by courier. The contrast between the two wills was stark. In the original, I was a primary beneficiary alongside my father. In the revised version, I was nearly written out entirely. Armed with this new information, I contacted a lawyer specializing in estate fraud. Then I reached out to a financial journalist who had once interviewed me for an article about freelance designers. She put me in touch with a colleague who covered real estate development and had been looking into my father's business practices for some time. 4 days after the wedding, Thomas finally called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was a masterpiece of deception. Amanda, I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. The Chicago meetings ran long, and then my phone died. I'm flying home tomorrow. Can't wait to see you and tell you all about it. Love you. I texted back, just 4 words. I saw you there. Screenshots. His response came minutes later. We need to talk. It's not what you think. But it was exactly what I thought and worse. As my investigation continued, I uncovered a complex web of financial entanglements between Thomas's startup and my father's company. What had initially appeared to be a standard investment was actually something closer to a bribe or payoff. I found a transfer of $50,000 from my father to Thomas shortly after we began dating. Another $75,000 when we got engaged. The startup was essentially a shell company, existing primarily on paper and funded almost entirely by my father. The most devastating discovery came a week after the wedding, when I met with Maria, my father's former assistant, who had been let go the previous year. Over coffee in a quiet corner of a cafe, she confirmed my worst suspicions. Your father hired Thomas to date you, she said, unable to meet my eyes. It started as a way to keep tabs on you after your mother died. Richard was worried you might contest your grandmother's will. So, our entire relationship was a lie? My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. At first, yes. But Thomas talked about you all the time at the office. I think he genuinely fell for you eventually. She reached across the table to touch my hand. That's why I got fired, you know. I told your father it was wrong to keep manipulating you, that you deserved to know the truth. That night, I sent Thomas a carefully worded text. I know everything. About the money. About why you started dating me. If you want any chance of explaining your side, come home tomorrow. Otherwise, don't bother coming back at all. His response was immediate. I'll be there. There's more to this than you know. As I waited for the confrontation that would determine the course of my future, I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected. Emails, bank records, calendar entries, the 2 versions of my grandmother's will, the wedding photos showing Thomas integrated with my family. I arranged them all in a folder labeled The Truth. Then I waited for the man I had loved, the man who had been paid to love me in return, to come home and face what he had done. Have you ever felt that gut punch moment when you realize someone close to you has been living a double life? The pieces were all falling into place for me, but I still had to confront Thomas face to face. Before I tell you about that explosive conversation, hit like if you've ever had your trust shattered by someone you thought you knew. And stay with me because what I discovered next changed everything about how I would get justice. Thomas returned on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 days after the wedding. I heard his key in the lock and steeled myself for the confrontation I had been rehearsing in my mind. He entered cautiously, setting his suitcase by the door as if unsure whether he would be staying. He looked tired, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his expression wary. Amanda, he began, taking a step toward me. I held up my hand to stop him. Don't come any closer. We stood in silence for a long moment, 3 years of what I thought was love hanging in the balance between us. I can explain, he finally said. Please do. My voice was steadier than I expected. Explain why you were at Natalie's wedding when you told me you were in Chicago. Explain why you've been meeting with my father behind my back for months. Explain the $50,000 he transferred to your account 3 years ago, right around the time we mysteriously met through mutual friends. His face paled. You've been investigating me? Wouldn't you? If you saw your fiancé at a wedding he claimed he couldn't attend, sitting comfortably with a family that excluded you? Thomas sank onto the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. It started as a business arrangement, he admitted. Your father approached me through a contact at my previous job. He said he needed someone to keep an eye on you after your mother died. He was worried about potential legal challenges to your grandmother's estate. So, you were hired to date me? The words tasted bitter in my mouth. Initially, yes. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. But Amanda, I fell in love with you for real. After the first few months, it wasn't an act anymore. Is that why you kept meeting with my father? Why you kept lying about where you were going? Because it wasn't an act. I got trapped in a situation. I tried to back out of the arrangement once I realized my feelings for you were genuine, but your father threatened to pull funding from my startup. Everything I've built would have collapsed. Your startup that's actually just a shell company funded entirely by my father. I raised an eyebrow. The one that doesn't actually have any real clients or products? Thomas flinched. We're developing real software. The funding arrangement is complicated, but the business is legitimate. Is that why you needed to be at Natalie's wedding? For business? Your father insisted. He said it would look suspicious if his future son-in-law wasn't there. But not suspicious that his actual daughter wasn't invited? I laughed bitterly. And what about our engagement? Was that part of the business arrangement too? No. Thomas stood up, taking a step toward me. I proposed because I love you. Your father was actually against it. He thought it would complicate things. Complicate what things, exactly? Before Thomas could answer, my phone rang. My father's name flashed on the screen. I showed it to Thomas, whose expression shifted from pleading to resigned. He's probably calling to do damage control, Thomas said. He knows I'm here. I put the phone on speaker. Hello, Dad. Amanda. My father's voice was tight with controlled anger. I understand Thomas is with you. Yes, we're having a fascinating conversation about how you hired my fiancé to spy on me. Would you like to join us and add your perspective? There was a pause then. This isn't a topic for a phone call. We should meet in person. Actually, I think speakerphone is perfect for this conversation. Thomas was just about to explain what our engagement was complicating in your master plan. Thomas, my father's voice hardened. Remember our agreement. What agreement is that, Dad? I pressed. The one where he pretends to love me? Or the one where he helps you steal my inheritance? That's enough, Amanda. My father's tone shifted to the condescending one I knew so well. You're being dramatic as usual. If you'd just let me explain. I'm all ears. Please explain why Stephanie was wearing Grandma's sapphire pendant at the wedding. The one that Grandma always said would be mine. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost see my father calculating his next move. Your grandmother changed her mind about certain bequests before she died, he said carefully. It's all perfectly legal. Except that I have a copy of her original will, I countered. The one she made when she was fully competent, before you started messing with her medication schedule during those last weeks. Who gave you that? My father's voice rose sharply. Those documents are confidential. Apparently your conscience isn't the only one that's been bothering people all these years. The three-way conversation continued to deteriorate from there. My father alternated between threats and attempts at emotional manipulation. Thomas sat in miserable silence, occasionally trying to interject with defenses that satisfied neither me nor my father. At one point, Stephanie joined the call, her shrill voice adding another layer to the chaos. Amanda, you need to stop this vindictive behavior, she said. Your father has only ever wanted what's best for the family. Which family is that, Stephanie? Because it's never included me. That's not true, my father interjected. We've always included you, as much as circumstances allowed. Circumstances like hiring my boyfriend to spy on me? Like changing Grandma's will when she was too drugged to know what she was signing? Like wearing her jewelry to a wedding I wasn't allowed to attend in person? The pendant is a family heirloom, Stephanie said defensively. I am family. It was supposed to pass through the maternal line, I countered. You're not my mother. Thank God for that, Stephanie muttered, not quite under her breath. As the argument escalated, I began secretly recording the conversation on my second phone. New Hampshire, where I lived, was a one-party consent state for recordings. Every damning admission, every threat, every contradiction was being preserved for future use. The breaking point came when my father, clearly frustrated by his inability to control the narrative, made an offer. Look, Amanda, perhaps we can come to an arrangement. There's no need for all this hostility. What if we set up a trust for you? Say, $200,000? Would that satisfy your concerns about your grandmother's estate? Are you trying to buy my silence, Dad? I'm trying to be fair. Family disputes like this can get messy and public. None of us want that, especially with the company going through an expansion phase. What company? Your real estate business or Thomas's fake startup? Reeves Tech is a legitimate subsidiary of Miller Development now, my father said stiffly. The acquisition was finalized last month. I looked at Thomas, who couldn't meet my eyes. So, you sold your company to my father? The one you said was going to make us rich? The one that justified all those late nights and business trips. It was a good deal, Thomas said weakly. I thought eventually we'd tell you together, once everything was settled. Once I was thoroughly trapped in this web of lies, you mean? Once I had married you, and it was too late to back out without a messy, expensive divorce. No one is trapped, my father interjected. Think of it as a merger of families and businesses. Thomas brings technical expertise we need for modernizing our property management systems. You could join the company too, Amanda. We could use someone with your design skills for marketing materials. The casual way he suggested incorporating me into his scheme after years of exclusion was the final straw. I don't want your money, I said coldly. I don't want a job at your company. What I want is everything that should have been mine from the beginning. Grandma's house, her jewelry, my fair share of her estate, and a public acknowledgement of what you've done. That's not going to happen, my father said, all pretense of reconciliation gone from his voice. Be reasonable, Amanda. Take the trust fund. Move on with your life. Without Thomas, you mean? Now that he's served his purpose. Thomas's relationship with you is never part of our official business arrangement, my father said carefully. Whatever personal relationship developed between you two is your own affair. How generous of you, I replied sarcastically. The call ended shortly after, with my father making vague threats about legal consequences if I pursued my baseless accusations and Stephanie adding a final barb about how I'd always been difficult, just like your mother. When the line went dead, Thomas and I sat in silence. Outside, rain had started to fall, pattering against the windows of the apartment we had shared, the home I had thought was built on love. What happens now? Thomas finally asked. I stood up and walked to the bedroom, returning with a small box that I placed on the coffee table between us. Inside was the engagement ring he had given me, nestled in its original velvet cushion. Now you leave, I said simply. Whatever real feelings developed between us, they grew from a foundation of lies. I can never trust you again. Amanda, please. His voice broke. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but what we have is real. What we have is a business transaction that got complicated. That's what my father said, right? That I was complicating things by actually falling in love with you. Thomas couldn't deny it. He took the ring box with trembling hands. Where will you go? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Some small part of me still cared about his welfare, despite everything. Your father has a corporate apartment I can use until I find a place, he admitted. Part of the acquisition deal. Of course. Even in this final moment, my father had ensured Thomas would land safely, while I was left to pick up the pieces alone. After Thomas packed a suitcase and left, I sat in the empty apartment, the rain still falling outside, and allowed myself one final evening of grief for the relationship I had thought was real. I cried for the love I had given so freely. I cried for the future I had planned with a man who had been paid to be with me. Then, as midnight approached, I dried my tears and opened my laptop. My father thought this ended with Thomas's exit and a generous trust fund to buy my silence. He had no idea that the confrontation was just the beginning of my response to their betrayal. I had recorded everything. I had documentation. I had witness testimony from people like Maria and Brad Jenkins. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. The next morning, I began implementing the plan that would bring justice not just for myself, but for my grandmother and mother as well. A plan that would shake my father's carefully constructed world to its foundations. The morning after Thomas moved out, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The initial shock and grief had hardened into determination. If my father thought I would quietly accept a payoff and disappear, he didn't know me at all. Then again, he had never bothered to really know me. My first call was to Diane Mercer, a forensic accountant recommended by my attorney. I forwarded her all the financial documents I had gathered, including the transfers between my father and Thomas, the acquisition paperwork for Reeves Tech, and the suspicious activity surrounding my grandmother's estate. "There's definitely something worth investigating here," Diane said after reviewing the materials. "These property transfers around the time of your grandmother's death raise several red flags for potential tax evasion." Tax evasion? I hadn't even considered that angle. Your father moved several properties into shell companies right before and after her death. It looks like he may have been trying to avoid estate taxes by making it appear the properties were sold at below market values to related business entities. This was exactly the kind of leverage I needed. My father feared public scandal above all else. His reputation in the business community was everything to him. My next step was to reach out to my mother's sister, Aunt Rebecca, who had become estranged from our family after my parents' divorce. We hadn't spoken in years, partly because my father had told me she wanted nothing to do with me, a claim I now questioned along with everything else he had ever told me. "Amanda," she answered the phone with surprise. "I never thought I'd hear from you again." "I'm sorry it's been so long," I said, suddenly emotional at hearing her voice. "I think I've been misled about a lot of things." Our conversation lasted hours as we pieced together our separate experiences with my father. She confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My father had systematically isolated me from my mother's side of the family through a campaign of misinformation and manipulation. "After your mom died, I tried to reach out so many times," Aunt Rebecca said. "But your father's lawyer sent cease and desist letters claiming I was harassing you. Eventually, I gave up. He told me you blamed me for Mom's stress during her illness," I said, still processing this new betrayal. "That you thought her cancer might have gone into remission if she hadn't been worrying about me so much." "Oh, Amanda." Her voice broke. "That's monstrous. I would never say such a thing. Your mother adored you. Her greatest worry at the end was that your father would cut you out completely once she was gone." By the end of our call, I had not only reconnected with my aunt, but discovered I had cousins, great-aunts, and family friends on my mother's side who had been trying to maintain contact with me for years. My father had intercepted cards, returned gifts, and spread rumors about my supposed disinterest in maintaining these relationships. Over the next 2 weeks, I methodically built my case against my father while reconnecting with my mother's family. I learned that my situation wasn't unique. My father had a history of manipulative business practices that had hurt many people over the years. Jackson's father, Peter Price, had once been my father's business partner until a suspicious contract clause had forced him out of their joint venture at a significant loss. Years later, desperate for financial stability, Peter had arranged his son's marriage to Natalie as a way back into my father's good graces. The entire wedding had been more business merger than romantic celebration. I reached out to former employees of my father's company who had been fired under questionable circumstances. Many were eager to share their experiences once they knew someone was finally challenging Richard Miller. Maria, my father's former assistant, introduced me to Samuel Chin, the company's former CFO who had left abruptly 3 years earlier. Over coffee in a quiet corner of a local cafe, he provided the missing pieces I needed. Your father has been using a network of shell companies to hide assets for years, Samuel explained, pointing to a diagram he had drawn. Not just to evade taxes, but to conceal property from business partners during negotiations and from your mother during their divorce. Do you have documentation? I asked. Samuel smiled grimly. I kept copies of everything before I left. I always knew someday someone would need this information. Armed with Samuel's documents and Diane's forensic analysis, I met with my attorney, Lisa Thompson, to discuss next steps. We have enough here for potential civil and criminal cases, Lisa said, reviewing the files. The question is, what do you want to achieve? I thought carefully before answering. I want what's rightfully mine from my grandmother's estate. I want my father held accountable for his actions. And I want the truth to be public, so he can't do this to anyone else. We can file a petition to invalidate the amended will based on your grandmother's lack of capacity, Lisa explained. With Brad Jenkins's testimony and the medical records showing the increase in her medication, we have a strong case. But your father will fight this aggressively. I'm ready, I assured her. What about the financial improprieties? That's where we have real leverage. Based on what Samuel provided, there are potential securities violations, tax evasion, and fraud charges that could interest federal authorities. However, she cautioned, once we go down that road, we can't control the outcome. Your father could face serious consequences, including criminal charges. I understand, I said quietly. But he's had years to make this right and chose deception at every turn. Over the next month, my team and I built our case methodically. We documented every transaction, every lie, every manipulation. I created a secure website containing all the evidence, accessible only with a password, ready to be shared with authorities or the media if necessary. I also began making strategic connections with my father's business competitors and former partners who had been similarly deceived. Peter Price, despite his daughter's marriage to Natalie, was particularly helpful in understanding the structure of my father's current business dealings. Richard has overextended himself on the Westlake development, Peter confided during a discreet meeting. He's leveraged everything on that project succeeding. Any significant disruption now would be catastrophic for him. This information shaped the timing of my approach. I would wait until the Westlake investors meeting, scheduled for next month, to make my first move. Throughout this time, I received increasingly desperate messages from both Thomas and my father. Thomas claimed he was falling apart without me, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to make amends. My father alternated between threats and improved financial offers to settle this family matter privately. I responded to none of them. As the investors' meeting approached, I carefully prepared my opening gambit. I wouldn't reveal everything at once, but just enough to demonstrate the seriousness of my position. My lawyer drafted a formal letter outlining the will contest and evidence of financial improprieties, with a clear message. We were prepared to take this information to the authorities and the media unless specific conditions were met. Those conditions included: 1. Return of all items specified in my grandmother's original will, including the Vermont house that had been sold, or its current market value, and all family jewelry too. Full financial accounting of my grandmother's estate. 3. Public acknowledgement of the deception regarding her will. 4. Immediate resignation of my father from any fiduciary positions in family trusts or estates. The letter was delivered by courier to my father's office the morning of the investors' meeting. An identical copy was sent to the family home, addressed to Stephanie. A third copy went to my father's attorney. Within hours, my phone exploded with calls and texts. I let them all go to voicemail as I sat in a cafe across the street from the building where the investors' meeting was taking place. Through the large windows, I could see my father's arriving in his executive car, his face tight with suppressed rage as he checked his phone repeatedly. My plan was working perfectly. He would be off balance during the meeting, distracted by my demands and the threat of exposure. The investors would notice his uncharacteristic anxiety, raising questions about his stability and the project's viability. Meanwhile, Samuel Chin was meeting with two key investors separately, ostensibly about an unrelated business opportunity. During that meeting, he would casually mention concerns about the Westlake project's financing structure, planting seeds of doubt that would grow when combined with my father's unusual behavior. As I watched my father enter the building, my phone lit up with a text from Natalie. "What have you done?" "Dad is freaking out." I replied simply, "Ask him about Grandma's will. Ask him about why he hired Thomas to date me. Ask him where the money for your wedding really came from." There was a long pause before her response. "Is that true? About Thomas?" "Every word. Ask him yourself." Another long pause. I didn't know. I swear. Whether I believed her or not was irrelevant. The cracks were beginning to form in my father's carefully constructed world. Family members questioning him. Business partners growing suspicious. The threat of public exposure looming over everything he had built. And this was just the beginning. 3 days after the investors' meeting, which I later learned had ended with several key backers requesting additional due diligence before committing more funds, my father finally requested a face-to-face meeting. "Just you and me," he specified.
"No lawyers. No recordings."
"We need to talk like family." I agreed, but with conditions of my own. We would meet in a public place of my choosing. I would have someone I trusted nearby. And he would come alone, no Stephanie, no business associates. We set the meeting for the following day at a busy restaurant in the city. As I prepared for this confrontation, I felt a strange calm. After years of being manipulated and lied to, I was finally taking control of my own story. The revenge I had planned was not just about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about exposing the truth, about justice for my mother and grandmother, about ensuring that my father could never again use his wealth and influence to hurt the people who should have been able to trust him most. As I closed my laptop that night, I looked at the collection of family photos I had gathered during my investigation. Images of my mother holding me as a baby, my grandmother teaching me to bake cookies, moments of genuine love that my father had tried to erase and replace with his manufactured version of family. Tomorrow, I would face him with the truth. And nothing would ever be the same again. The meeting with my father took place at Riverside Cafe, a busy restaurant overlooking the harbor. I arrived early, securing a corner table with a good view of the entrance. My Aunt Rebecca sat at the bar, pretending to be a stranger, but close enough to intervene if necessary. When my father walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. In the months since I had begun my campaign, he had aged visibly. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the cautious movements of a man under siege. "Amanda," he said, taking the seat across from me. No hug, no kiss on the cheek, just my name spoken like a question. "Dad," I replied evenly. "Thank you for coming." He glanced around nervously before speaking. "This has gone far enough. You've made your point. Have I? What point do you think I'm making? That you feel excluded, overlooked. I understand you're upset about the wedding, about Thomas. But bringing the IRS and my investors into a family disagreement is taking things too far." I took a sip of water, letting his words hang in the air between us. "This isn't about feeling excluded, Dad. This is about you systematically lying to me, manipulating me, and stealing what was rightfully mine." "I never stole from you," he protested, but his eyes flickered away, unable to meet mine. "Grandma's will? The Vermont house? The sapphire jewelry? The trust fund she established that somehow disappeared after her death. There were expenses, end-of-life care. Stop lying." I cut him off. "I have the hospital bills. I have the original will. I have statements from her attorney and doctor." My father's face hardened. "What exactly do you want, Amanda? Money? Is that it? Name your price, and let's end this before it destroys everything. I sent you my conditions in the letter. Did you read it? Those terms are impossible. The Vermont house was sold years ago. Some of the jewelry has been promised to Natalie, and a public acknowledgement would damage the family name needlessly." The family name. I couldn't help but laugh. "You mean your reputation, your business standing. That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Appearances. The perfect family image, even if it meant erasing me when I didn't fit the picture. For the first time, something like shame flickered across my father's face. I never intended to erase you. Things just evolved after I married Stephanie. She had certain expectations about our life together. And I was inconvenient to those expectations. He didn't answer directly. I try to provide for you financially. Your mother's settlement, your college tuition. The bare minimum required by the divorce agreement. I corrected him. And then you hired my boyfriend to spy on me, to make sure I wouldn't cause problems about Grandma's will. My father looked genuinely startled.
Who told you that? Thomas.
Maria. Does it matter? It's true, isn't it? After a long pause, he nodded almost imperceptibly. It wasn't supposed to become serious between you two. Just a way to keep informed about your activities after your mother died. You were so angry, making accusations about the will. We were concerned you might take legal action. Because you knew the will was fraudulent. Not fraudulent. Your grandmother changed her mind at the end. While heavily medicated and being isolated from everyone except you and Stephanie. We went back and forth like this for nearly an hour, my father alternating between defense, justification, and occasional glimpses of genuine regret. Throughout, I maintained a calm exterior that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. Finally, when it became clear we were at an impasse, I placed a USB drive on the table between us. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything," I replied simply. "Financial records, witness statements, recordings, communications between you and Thomas. The original and fraudulent wills side by side. Evidence of tax evasion going back 15 years. Everything I've discovered in the past month." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the drive. "This is a copy," I continued. "The originals are secured with multiple people, set to be released to authorities and the media if anything happens to me or if you fail to meet my terms." "You're blackmailing me," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm negotiating from a position of strength," I corrected him. "Something you taught me, though not intentionally. You have 48 hours to agree to my terms, or I move forward with both legal action and public disclosure." I stood to leave, but my father caught my wrist. "Amanda, wait. You're my daughter. Despite everything, doesn't that mean something to you?" Looking into his eyes, I saw not the powerful, intimidating figure who had shaped my childhood, but an aging man terrified of losing everything he had built. "It did mean something," I said quietly. "That's why this hurt so much."
48 hours, Dad.
"The choice is yours." Exactly 47 hours later, my father's attorney contacted mine with a counteroffer. They would return all jewelry mentioned in the original will, pay the current market value of the Vermont house plus interest, create a new trust in my name with the amount specified in the original will plus 20 years of growth, and provide a full accounting of my grandmother's estate. The only modification to my demands was the public acknowledgement. Instead of a public statement, my father offered a private family gathering where he would admit his wrongdoing to all extended family members from both sides. After consulting with my legal team, I accepted these terms with one addition. Thomas would be required to return all funds received from my father and dissolve any business relationship between them. The papers were signed 3 days later. Within a week, I received the first installment of restitution and a box containing my grandmother's jewelry, including the sapphire pendant that had been around Stephanie's neck at the wedding. The family gathering took place the following month at a neutral location, a private room in an upscale hotel. Relatives from both my mother's and father's sides attended, many meeting for the first time in decades. The atmosphere was tense until my father stood and began to speak. "I've asked you all here today because I owe my daughter Amanda an apology," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Over the years, I have made decisions that prioritized my new family and my business interests over her well-being. I altered my mother's will against her wishes. I deliberately isolated Amanda from many of you through deception. And I interfered in her personal life in ways that were inappropriate and harmful." Watching him admit these things in front of witnesses was surreal. Some relatives gasped. Others nodded as if they had suspected as much all along. Stephanie sat rigidly beside him, her face a mask of controlled anger. As part of making amends, my father continued, I have restored Amanda's inheritance as it was originally intended. I am also reopening channels of communication between our extended families that I previously obstructed. The gathering became a long overdue family reunion. I connected with cousins I barely remembered, aunts and uncles who shared stories about my mother, distant relatives who had wondered for years what had happened to me. Photos were taken, contact information exchanged, tentative plans made for future gatherings. My father and Stephanie left early, their part in the proceedings completed. As they exited, I noticed Natalie lingering behind, seemingly torn between following her parents and staying. To my surprise, she approached me as the evening was winding down. I didn't know, she said without preamble. About Thomas, about the will, about any of it. I thought you just didn't want to be part of the family. At 17, she seemed suddenly younger than her years, a child caught in adult machinations. I believe you, I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. You were raised in the environment they created. They're getting divorced, she blurted out. Dad and Stephanie. After everything that happened, they're splitting up. She's furious about the money he's giving back to you. This was news to me, but not entirely surprising. Their relationship had always been transactional, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. Are you okay? I asked, feeling an unexpected concern for this half-sister I barely knew. She shrugged, a typical teenage gesture. I'm going to college next year anyway. Columbia. Dad's already transferred the tuition into a separate account, so it's protected from whatever happens next. Always the businessman, my father, even in the midst of personal collapse. If you ever need to talk, I offered. I'm here. We're still family in our way. Natalie nodded awkwardly, then rejoined a group of cousins her age, the tentative connection between us, neither rejected nor fully embraced. In the months that followed, the promised restitution was completed. My father's business suffered as rumors of financial improprieties spread despite our private settlement, and several major projects, including Westlake, were put on indefinite hold. The divorce proceedings between him and Stephanie became contentious, with allegations of infidelity on both sides making their way into local gossip circles. Thomas attempted to contact me several times, each message more desperate than the last. He had lost his company, his financial backing, and apparently his self-respect. His final email acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed what seemed like genuine remorse, but ended with yet another plea for reconciliation that I did not answer. As for me, I used a portion of my restored inheritance to establish a foundation focused on supporting elder care advocacy and preventing financial exploitation of vulnerable seniors. The foundation was named after my grandmother, a small way of honoring what should have been her true legacy. I also connected with a network of people who had similar experiences with family financial abuse, creating resources and support systems I wished had existed when I was going through it alone. This work became unexpectedly fulfilling, giving purpose to the pain I had endured. Through this network, I met Daniel, a financial investigator who had helped his own grandfather recover assets hidden by unscrupulous relatives. Our shared experiences and commitment to preventing similar abuses created an immediate connection that gradually developed into something more. Unlike with Thomas, this relationship grew slowly, built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. 1 year after the fateful wedding livestream, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a framed photograph of my mother and grandmother together, smiling in front of the Vermont house that should have been my inheritance. A note from my father accompanied it. Found this while cleaning out storage. Thought you should have it. The house and the memories were always meant to be yours. It wasn't exactly an apology, but for my father it was something close to one. I placed the photo on my mantle, a reminder of where I came from and what I had overcome. The frozen image from Natalie's wedding livestream, the one that had revealed so much betrayal in a single frame, remains saved on my computer. I rarely look at it now, but I keep it as a reminder that sometimes the most painful revelations can ultimately set you free. That moment of technical failure had been a gift, forcing me to see what had been happening around me all along and giving me the evidence I needed to reclaim my rightful place in my family's story. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind. If my story resonated with you in any way, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family justice in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who wronged you? What gave you the strength to do it? Like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding your voice after betrayal, and share this video with someone who might need to know they're not alone in their family struggles. Thank you for listening to my journey from exclusion to empowerment. Remember, sometimes the family we build for ourselves after betrayal becomes stronger than the one we were born into.